The barn door hung crooked on its iron hinge, and through the gap, Caleb Marsh could see her knees folded against the dirt floor. She wasn't screaming. That's what stopped him cold. Not the chains, not the way her wrists were yanked behind her back and locked to a rusted post, not even the torn gray dress that barely covered her shoulders. It was the silence. The way she'd turned her face toward the wall like she could will herself into the wood grain if she stayed still enough. "Don't look there." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cracked through the barn like a whip. Caleb froze in the doorway, one boot still in the dust outside, the other on the threshold. The lantern in his hand swung slightly, throwing her shadow long and broken across the hay bales stacked against the far wall. I said, "Don't look." She didn't turn around. Her hair, dark, matted with dirt and sweat, hung in clumps over her face. Her shoulders trembled, but not from cold, from shame, from the kind of humiliation that carved itself so deep into a person they'd rather vanish than be seen. Caleb swallowed hard. His throat felt like sand. He'd come out here because someone said there were horses for sale, cheap, no questions asked. The kind of transaction that happened in barns like this one, miles from town, where the law didn't bother riding and folks didn't bother asking why. But there were no horses, just her, and 3 men standing near the barn's entrance, watching him like vultures circling a carcass. The one in the middle, broad-shouldered, wearing a dusty black coat and a hat pulled low, grinned. His teeth were crooked, stained yellow from tobacco. He spat into the dirt and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "You, Marsh?" Caleb nodded slowly, his eyes still on the girl. She hadn't moved, hadn't looked up. "Got your money?" Caleb's jaw tightened. His hand instinctively moved toward his coat pocket, where a folded envelope of bills sat heavy against his ribs. He'd brought it for a horse. A good mare. Something to replace the one he'd lost last winter when the fever swept through his ranch and took half his herd with it. "I came for a horse," Caleb said quietly. The man's grin widened. "She don't complain much, strong back, works hard. Hell, might even cook if you ask her nice." Caleb's stomach turned. The other 2 men laughed, low, ugly sounds that echoed off the barn walls. One of them kicked at a bucket near his feet, sending it clattering across the floor. The girl flinched at the noise, but still didn't turn around. "She got a name?" Caleb asked, his voice flat. "Does it matter?" The man in black shrugged. "You're paying for her, not marrying her." Caleb's hand twitched. His fingers brushed the handle of the revolver tucked into his belt, hidden beneath his coat. He didn't draw it. Not yet. But the weight of it was suddenly the only thing keeping him grounded. "How much?" The man's grin faltered slightly, replaced by something sharper, something calculating. 200. It was robbery. Even for a horse, 200 was steep. For a person, for this, it was something worse than robbery. It was complicity. Caleb reached into his coat and pulled out the envelope. He didn't open it, didn't count, just held it out, his hand steady even though his heart was hammering against his ribs like a caged animal trying to break free. The man in black stepped forward and snatched it from Caleb's hand. He thumbed through the bills quickly, his eyes narrowing as he counted. Then he nodded, satisfied, and stuffed the envelope into his coat. "She's yours." The words hung in the air like smoke. Caleb turned back toward the girl. She still hadn't moved. Her breathing was shallow, rapid. Her hands, bound behind her, were clenched into fists, so tight her knuckles had gone white. "Key," Caleb said. The man in black tossed it to him. It landed in the dirt near Caleb's boot. He bent down slowly, picked it up, and walked toward her. Each step felt like wading through mud. When he knelt beside her, she finally spoke again. "Please." Her voice was so small it barely reached him. "Please don't." Caleb's chest tightened. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words lodged in his throat like stones. Instead, he reached for the chains, his hands shaking slightly as he fumbled with the lock. The key turned with a harsh metallic click. The chains fell away. She didn't move. Caleb stood slowly, stepping back to give her space. He glanced over his shoulder. The three men were already walking away, their laughter fading into the dusk outside. They didn't care what happened next. They'd gotten their money. That was all that mattered. Caleb looked down at her again. She'd finally turned her head slightly, just enough that he could see her profile. The sharp line of her jaw, the bruise blooming purple along her cheekbone, and something else. A scar, thin, white, running from the corner of her left eye down to her jawline. Caleb's breath caught. He knew that scar. His mind reeled backward. 8 years, maybe 9. A homestead burning in the distance. Screams cutting through the night. He'd been riding with a group of men back then, hired hands for a cattle drive that took them through the valley. They'd seen the smoke, heard the gunfire, but they hadn't stopped. They'd kept riding. And later, when Caleb had circled back alone, guilt gnawing at him like a wolf on a bone, he'd found a girl bleeding in the dirt. She'd been maybe 14, maybe younger. He'd wrapped her wound with a strip of his shirt, whispered something useless about help coming, and then left. He'd left. Because staying meant answering questions, meant getting involved, meant risking his own neck for someone he didn't even know. Now she was kneeling in front of him again, and he couldn't breathe. "Your name," he said hoarsely. She looked up at him fully for the first time. Her eyes were dark, hollow, filled with something far worse than fear. Recognition. "You already know it," she whispered. And Caleb realized, with a sickening twist in his gut, that she was right. They didn't speak on the ride back to his ranch. Caleb had brought a spare horse, an old gelding he'd planned to trade for supplies in town. He helped her onto it without a word, keeping his eyes on the reins instead of her face. She didn't thank him, didn't protest, just sat stiff in the saddle, her hands gripping the horn so tightly her fingers had gone pale. The sun was sinking fast, painting the horizon in shades of orange and red that reminded Caleb of fire. He kept his head down and urged his mare forward. By the time they reached his property, a modest stretch of land with a weathered cabin, a corral, and a half-collapsed barn, the sky had turned indigo. Stars were beginning to poke through the darkness like pinpricks in cloth. Caleb dismounted and tied his horse to the post near the water trough. He glanced over at the girl. She hadn't moved. "Come on," he said quietly. She slid off the gelding slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. When her boots hit the ground, she swayed slightly, and Caleb instinctively reached out to steady her. She jerked away from his touch like he'd burned her. "I'm not—" Caleb started, then stopped. He didn't know how to finish that sentence. "I'm not going to hurt you." But why would she believe him? He'd paid money for her. $200. In her mind, he'd bought her the same way those men had sold her. He let his hand drop. "There's a room inside," he said instead. "Small, but it's warm. You can sleep there." She stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded once and followed him toward the cabin. Inside, the air smelled like old wood and coffee. A single lantern flickered on the table, casting long shadows across the walls. Caleb gestured toward a narrow doorway on the far side of the room. "Through there. Blankets on the bed. I'll bring you some water." She walked past him without a word and disappeared into the room. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Caleb stood in the middle of his cabin, staring at the closed door, and wondered what the hell he'd just done. 3 days passed. She didn't speak, didn't eat much, just stayed in that room, emerging only when Caleb left food outside her door, or when she needed to use the outhouse behind the cabin. Caleb didn't push. He worked the ranch, mended fences, fed the horses. At night, he sat at the table and stared into his coffee, trying not to think about the scar on her face or the way she'd looked at him in that barn. On the 4th morning, he found her standing in the doorway of the cabin, watching him chop wood. He paused mid-swing, the axe hanging in the air. "You need something?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Just stood there, arms crossed, her dark eyes fixed on him, like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Finally, she spoke. "Why'd you do it?" Caleb lowered the axe. "Do what?" "Buy me." The words hit him harder than he expected. He set the axe down and wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "I didn't." He stopped, started again. "I didn't know what else to do." "You could have walked away." "Yeah." He met her gaze. "I could have." Her jaw tightened. "So why didn't you?" Caleb hesitated. He could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on him, heavy and suffocating. He'd carried it for 8 years, kept it buried, told himself it didn't matter because there was nothing he could do to change it. But looking at her now, standing in his doorway, alive despite everything, he knew he couldn't run from it anymore. "Because I already walked away once," he said quietly. Her expression shifted. Confusion flickered across her face, followed by something darker. "What?" Caleb took a slow breath. 8 years ago, valley just south of here. There was a homestead, your homestead. It was burning. I heard the shots, saw the smoke." Her entire body went rigid. "I was riding with a group of men. We didn't stop. His voice cracked slightly. "We kept going. Told ourselves it wasn't our fight. That getting involved would get us killed." She took a step back, her hand gripping the doorframe for support. "But I came back," Caleb continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Later, alone, I found you in the dirt. You were bleeding. That cut on your face. I wrapped it, told you help was coming." Her breathing quickened. "And then I left," Caleb said. "I left you there, because I was too much of a coward to stay." The silence that followed was suffocating. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and trembling with something that wasn't quite rage but wasn't far from it. "You were there. Yes. You saw what they did." "Yes." Her hands curled into fists at her sides. "And you did nothing. I know. My father died in that fire. My brother, too. They burned alive while you rode away." Caleb's chest felt like it was caving in. "I know." She stared at him for a long moment, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. Then she turned and walked back into the cabin, slamming the door behind her. Caleb stood alone in the yard, the axe forgotten at his feet, and wondered if redemption was even possible for someone like him. That night he found a note slipped under his door. It was written in shaky handwriting on a scrap of paper, torn from an old ledger. "My name is Lena." He read it 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it in his shirt pocket, right over his heart. The riders came on the 6th day. Caleb was repairing the fence line near the eastern edge of his property when he heard the hoofbeats. Steady, deliberate, too many to be friendly. He straightened slowly, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle leaning against the fence post. 4 men crested the hill, silhouetted against the mid-morning sun. They rode in a loose formation, their hats pulled low, their coats dusty from the trail. At the front was a man Caleb recognized immediately. Sheriff Dalton. Caleb's stomach dropped. Dalton was a big man, tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick gray beard and cold blue eyes that missed nothing. He wore a badge pinned to his vest, but everyone in the county knew it was just for show. Dalton enforced his own law, and his law favored whoever paid him the most. The riders stopped a few yards from Caleb. Dalton leaned forward in his saddle, his hands resting casually on the horn. "Marsh." "Sheriff." Dalton's gaze swept over the property, taking in the cabin, the corral, the half-collapsed barn. "Nice place you got here. Quiet." Caleb didn't respond. "Heard you made a purchase a few days back," Dalton continued, his tone conversational. "That true?" Caleb's grip tightened on the rifle. "I bought a horse." "That's so." Dalton's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Funny thing. Got a report from some folks down south. Said you bought something else. Something that wasn't exactly yours to take. I paid for it." "Did you now?" Dalton leaned back in his saddle, his smile widening. "See, here's the problem, Marsh. That girl you took, she ain't yours to keep. She's property, and property belongs to its rightful owner." Caleb's jaw tightened. "She's not property." Dalton's smile vanished. "That's where you're wrong." One of the riders, a younger man with a scar running down his neck, spat into the dirt. "Where is she, Marsh?" Caleb's eyes flicked toward the cabin. The door was closed. He couldn't see Lena, but he knew she was inside, listening. "She's under my protection," Caleb said evenly. Dalton chuckled. "Your protection? That's real noble of you, Marsh. But the law don't see it that way. And neither do the men who paid good money for her in the first place." "She's not going back." Dalton's expression hardened. "You think you got a choice here?" "I think I've got a rifle," Caleb said quietly, "and I think you're on my land." The tension snapped taut like a bowstring. The 4 riders shifted in their saddles, their hands drifting toward their holsters. Dalton's smile returned, but it was sharp now, predatory. "You're making a mistake, Marsh." "Wouldn't be my first." Dalton stared at him for a long moment, his eyes cold and calculating. Then he straightened in his saddle and turned his horse around. "We'll be back," he said over his shoulder, "and next time you won't have a choice." The riders followed him, their hoofbeats fading into the distance. Caleb stood alone in the dirt, his heart pounding, and waited until they were gone before lowering the rifle. When he walked back to the cabin, Lena was standing in the doorway. "They'll come back," she said quietly. I know. Why didn't you just give me up? Caleb looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the girl from the barn, not the victim he'd failed 8 years ago, but someone who'd survived despite everything the world had thrown at her. Because some things are worth standing for, he said. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she stepped aside, letting him into the cabin. They'll bring more men next time, she said. I know. You can't fight them all! Caleb set the rifle down on the table and met her gaze. Maybe not, but I'm not giving you back. Lena's eyes softened slightly. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something close. You're stubborn, she said. Yeah. Caleb allowed himself a small, bitter smile. That's what they tell me. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending dust swirling across the yard. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and Caleb knew with absolute certainty that the storm was just beginning. So let me ask you something. If you were Caleb, would you have stayed? Would you have stood your ground knowing the law was crooked and the odds were stacked against you? Or would you have walked away like he did 8 years ago? Take a deep breath. Pour yourself a cup of tea. Think about that. And if you're still with me, tap subscribe real quick so you don't miss how this turns out. Tell me what time it is for you right now and where you're listening from. Because this next part, it's where everything changes. The next 2 days passed in uneasy silence. Caleb reinforced the cabin door, nailed boards over the windows, and checked his ammunition twice. He didn't have much. Maybe 20 rounds for the rifle, a handful more for his revolver. Enough to make a stand, but not enough to win a war. Lena watched him work without saying much. She stayed inside, mostly, but occasionally she'd step out onto the porch and stare at the horizon, like she was waiting for something. On the second evening, Caleb found her sitting on the steps, her knees drawn up to her chest. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. He sat down beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. You ever think about leaving? She asked quietly. The ranch? All of it. She gestured vaguely at the land around them. Starting over, somewhere new, somewhere they wouldn't find you. Caleb considered the question. Yeah, I think about it sometimes. Why don't you? Because running doesn't fix anything, he said. Just moves the problem somewhere else. Lena was quiet for a long time. Then she said, My father used to say something like that. Caleb glanced at her. He sounds like a good man. He was. Her voice was soft, barely audible over the wind. He was trying to protect us. That's why they came. He'd filed a claim on some land up north. Rich land. Good for farming. But some men in town didn't like it. Said he was a traitor to the Union. Said the land should go to real Americans. Caleb's chest tightened. They burned him out, Lena continued. Killed him and my brother. Left me for dead. She touched the scar on her face, absently. But I didn't die. I'm sorry, Caleb said quietly. She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face. You said that before, in the barn, when you wrapped my wound. Caleb swallowed hard. Yeah. I didn't remember you at first, she said, but I do now. You told me help was coming. You lied. I know. Why'd you come back alone? Caleb hesitated. He'd asked himself that question 1,000 times over the years, and he still didn't have a good answer. Guilt, maybe, he said finally. Or cowardice. I don't know. I told myself I was being careful, that riding back with a group would have been too dangerous. But the truth is I was scared. Scared of what I'd find. Scared of what it would mean if I stayed. Lena studied him for a long moment. You're still scared? Yeah. Caleb let out a slow breath. But I'm tired of running. She didn't respond right away. Just sat there, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Finally, she said, "Thank you." Caleb blinked, caught off guard. For what? For not leaving this time. Her words hit him harder than any punch. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. They sat in silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, and for the first time in 8 years, Caleb felt something close to peace. That night, Lena cooked. It wasn't much, just beans and cornbread, but it was the first real meal Caleb had eaten in days. They sat across from each other at the small table, the lantern flickering between them. You learn that from your father? Caleb asked, nodding toward the cornbread. My mother, Lena said. She died when I was young, but she taught me enough before she left. Caleb took another bite, savoring the warmth. She did a good job. Lena smiled faintly. It was small, fleeting, but it was there. And for just a moment, the weight of everything, the guilt, the fear, the violence waiting on the horizon, lifted. Outside, the wind howled softly through the trees, and Caleb allowed himself to believe, just for a moment, that maybe redemption was possible after all. They came at dawn. Caleb heard them before he saw them. The low rumble of hoofbeats, the creak of saddle leather, the murmur of voices carried on the wind. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, peering through a gap in the boards. There were more this time. At least 8. Maybe 10. Sheriff Dalton sat at the front, his face hard and impassive. Behind him were the same men from before, plus a few new faces, hired guns by the look of them. Men who didn't care about the law, only the money. Caleb's heart hammered in his chest. Marsh! Dalton's voice boomed across the yard. This is your last chance. Send her out and we'll let you walk away. No one has to die today. Caleb didn't answer. Lena appeared at his side, her face pale but determined. You can still let me go. No, Caleb said flatly. They'll kill you. Maybe. He checked the rifle's chamber, his hands steady despite the fear coursing through him. But I'm done running. Lena's jaw tightened. Then I'm staying too. Before Caleb could argue, a new sound cut through the morning air. More hoofbeats. Caleb's head snapped toward the eastern ridge and his breath caught. A group of riders was cresting the hill. Ranch hands, farmers, men Caleb recognized from town. At the front was old Ben Tucker, a grizzled rancher who'd worked cattle with Caleb for nearly 20 years. Beside him rode Sam Coltrane, the blacksmith, and his 2 sons. Behind them, at least a dozen more. They weren't soldiers, they weren't lawmen, just locals, neighbors. Men who'd decided they weren't going to let corruption and cruelty run their county. Old Ben reined his horse to a stop between Caleb's cabin and Dalton's men. He was in his 60s, wiry and tough as leather, with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too many hard winters. Sheriff, Ben said, his voice calm but firm. What's all this about? Dalton's expression darkened. This ain't your business, Tucker. When you're on my neighbor's land with a small army, it becomes my business. Ben glanced toward the cabin. Caleb all right in there? He's fine, Caleb called back. Ben nodded. Then he turned back to Dalton, his hand resting casually on the rifle across his saddle. So, what's the problem here? Dalton's jaw tightened. The girl inside that cabin is stolen property. I'm here to reclaim her. Stolen property, Ben repeated the words slowly, letting them hang in the air. Then he spat into the dirt. That's a hell of a thing to say, Sheriff, especially since slavery ended 6 years ago. A murmur ran through the crowd of men behind him. Dalton's face flushed red. This is legal business. Legal business, Ben interrupted, would involve a warrant. You got one. Dalton hesitated. That's what I thought. Ben shifted in his saddle, his gaze sweeping over the hired guns behind Dalton. Now I've known most of you boys for years. You're ranch hands, drovers, good men who fell on hard times. But this, he gestured toward the cabin, this ain't worth dying for. One of the hired guns glanced at Dalton, then back at Ben. Slowly, he lowered his weapon. Another followed, then another. Dalton's face twisted with rage. You're making a mistake. No, Ben said quietly. I think we're fixing one. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then Dalton yanked his reins and turned his horse around. This ain't over, Tucker. Yeah, it is, Ben said. Dalton and his remaining men rode off, disappearing over the ridge. The hired guns who'd stayed behind dismounted, muttering apologies before drifting away on foot. Ben rode up to the cabin and dismounted. Caleb stepped outside, Lena close behind him. Appreciate it, Ben, Caleb said quietly. Ben shrugged. You'd have done the same for me. He tipped his hat toward Lena. Ma'am. Lena nodded, her eyes glistening. Ben looked between them, then cleared his throat. You two all right? Yeah, Caleb said. We're all right. Days turned into weeks. Lena stayed. She mended clothes, planted seeds, helped Caleb repair the barn. She didn't talk much about the past, and Caleb didn't push. But slowly, carefully, they built something new. One evening, Caleb found her standing near the fence line, staring at the place where her father's homestead used to be. He walked up beside her, holding 2 small wooden crosses he'd carved by hand. Thought maybe we could put these up, he said quietly. For your father and brother. Lena stared at the crosses for a long moment. Then she took one from him and held it close to her chest. Thank you, she whispered. They buried the crosses side by side near the eastern edge of Caleb's property, where the land stretched wide and the wild flowers grew in the spring. Lena stood over the graves for a long time, her lips moving in silent prayer. Caleb stood a few paces back, giving her space. When she finally turned around, her eyes were red but clear. I'm staying, she said. Caleb nodded. I know. She took a step closer. Not because I owe you, and not because I've forgiven you. Not yet. I understand, but maybe someday, she said quietly. Caleb met her gaze, and for the first time in 8 years he felt the weight of his guilt begin to lift. Someday's enough, he said. Years later, travelers passing through the valley would see 2 crosses near the fence line of the Marsh Ranch. They'd see smoke rising from the cabin chimney, hear the sound of laughter carried on the wind, and wonder what stories those walls held. But Caleb and Lena never told them. Some wounds ran too deep for words, and some redemptions were built not on forgiveness, but on the slow, steady work of showing up every day and choosing to be better than the person you used to be. The sun dipped lower. Dust rose around their feet, and in the distance the land stretched endlessly, wild and free.